People often ask, what's for dinner? But does anyone ever ask, where did our dinner come from? Or, how was our dinner grown? Or even, will there be something for dinner next year? As production resources are spread thinner and thinner over a growing global population, these are the kinds of questions that give us something to chew on. Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Jay Weeks, PhD candidate in the Department of Agronomy. My co-host is Scott Tonona, an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy who specializes in the philosophy of science. For today's interview, we have a very special guest, Dan Stone, formerly a senior reporter at Newsweek and former editor for National Geographic covering environmental science and agriculture. Dan is the author of The Food Explorer, a book that chronicles the adventures of K-State alumnus David Fairchild. An informal emissary with the United States government, Fairchild leveraged agronomy, horticulture, and botany as tools for international trade and diplomacy in an age when food diversity was limited in the United States.
Oh, welcome, Dan. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us for a little while. We're going to get a little bit into your book and why that's important both to K-State and Manhattan and the global food system in general, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a journalist and science writer. I live out in Washington, D.C., and I work for I write for National Geographic. I used to cover politics. I used to cover the White House, and now I cover sort of the intersection of science and policy, particularly related to agriculture, botany, and the economy. So our food, what we eat, why we eat it, the economic principles at play, and the stories of history that explain sort of what our supermarkets look like and the foods that we have the choice of and the stories behind what we eat.
What was it that sparked your interest in ag and food and all of that sort of thing as opposed to politics? Yeah,
I grew up in California near farms, working on farms. I went to college up near Sacramento at UC Davis.
It's a big ag school.
Big ag school, yeah. And I worked on a peach farm. I worked on a strawberry farm and really loved the sense of research and innovation on farms, figuring out how to farm the soil and how each season could be better than the season prior. Farming is very hard work, as anyone knows who's ever done it. But there are ways to make it better and easier or more plentiful with each passing season by using science. And we see companies do that. We also see farmers do it. And I loved that process. When I went to Washington, I mentioned I covered politics, but eventually I wanted to cover science again. And I wanted to cover stories that were not being covered, cover people whose stories were untold. And usually with scientific research, it's stories that are really complicated and that, don't always have the most compelling or charismatic character behind them, but are really important. And if you could find these people and you could find clever ways of telling these stories, they are usually stories that people haven't heard before.
Oh, that's great. Speaking of those kinds of peoples and the stories that you've found behind them, so you're here at K-State talking about your book, The Food Explorer,
yeah.
And that sort of chronicles the travels of David Fairchild, an alumnus of K-State. What got you interested in David Fairchild? What sparked that?
Yeah, I mentioned my background in food and farming and policy and history, and I heard of Fairchild one day at National Geographic. I heard him described as a roving botanist, a man who traveled the world in search of new plants to bring back to America. And I had never heard anyone have that title, botanist and roving adventurer. And Fairchild was on the board of National Geographic and had written essays, stories for the magazine. And I read all of them. And I thought two things. One, why haven't I ever heard of this guy? And why hasn't anybody heard of this guy? And I want to tell his story. I want to dig into his archives and find the story of his life and bring him to life.
Interesting. So Fairchild was here in the late 1800s, right? In the late 1880s. What did the agricultural landscape in the U.S. look like, and what did he do? Why was he important?
Yeah, Fairchild was here because his father was courted from Michigan State Agricultural College to become the president of Kansas State Agricultural College. And so the Fairchilds took a train from Lansing, Michigan, down here to Manhattan. They'd never been here before. And George Fairchild became the president, and young David Fairchild became the president's son and a student here eventually. And he was surrounded by some realities in America, but here, in the center, in the heartland of the country. One, that a lot of people were farmers. Two, that farmers weren't really part of the prosperity of the Gilded Age, right? Like railroads did really well. The banks were really growing. Washington was feeling prosperous and emergent 3 decades after the Civil War. But to be a farmer was hard, and you didn't really make much money. In fact, the harder you worked, the less money you made because of your output. And this was a problem of crop diversity. There were too many farmers growing too few crops. There was corn, there were oats, there was a lot of dairy, there was barley, but not a lot of diversity, certainly not in the way we think of today when you walk into a supermarket. So farming was a really hard equation to square in those days, and Fairchild saw it here in Manhattan, and also just, everyone he knew was a farmer struggling.
How widely recognized was that as an issue? I mean, was this like a particular insight by Fairchild, or were people kind of seeing this as a problem, right? Sort of not being part of the prosperity of the country.
People could see it. Certainly farmers could see it here and elsewhere. Washington didn't quite see it to the extent that they needed to. Mm-hmm. And people here were really angry. They said, Washington's looking out for every other industry, and yet this American notion that if we work really hard, that we'll be okay, is leaving us poorer. Right. And so, it was sort of this disconnect between the federal government and the states that led to, pretty fiery language. People fired up, and, pastors and activists and people making speeches about, how we were left behind here in the center of the country.
So what's Fairchild's story? Did he take that passion and move with it, or did it just sit with him for a little while?
He took that passion, and that's what sparked his sense of, I need to do something to help farmers in this country, because farming is really most of the economy, and by helping farmers, I can help boost this country. Mm-hmm. That was one. Another thing that happened was in the early 1880s, Fairchild had an encounter with a visiting scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace, a
discoverer of evolution,
of natural selection, and evolution. Wallace had been to the Malay Islands of Indonesia and Malaysia, and came through Manhattan, Kansas on a speaking tour and stayed with the Fairchilds. George Fairchild was the president of the school. And so young Fairchild meets Alfred Russel Wallace, this great, illustrious researcher who inspires him with descriptions of the other side of the planet and the tropics and the plants and the animals and the foods that you could taste on the other side of the world. And that really fueled Fairchild's imagination and eventually gave life to his vision.
I can't imagine what that would be like. It's sort of the state where, everything that you see around you, right? It's so foreign in a way from what we have today with just the availability of all kinds of foods now, right? To think of hearing about these amazing things that you have never seen, right? And the potential availability. So that got him out of here.
Yeah. I usually like to say that meeting Alfred Russel Wallace, meeting a world traveler to that extent and of that renown, was like meeting an astronaut. It was like meeting someone who walked on the moon, who had gone somewhere no one else you knew had ever been.
Right. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. So where did Fairchild go from there? Once he finished his degree at K-State, correct?
Yes, he did.
And then what?
He did some master's work in Iowa, and then found his way to Washington D.C, where he became a junior staffer at the USDA in plant pathology, finding and researching crop diseases and how to treat them. And it was in that capacity that he got another connection, and he got an opportunity to work for the Smithsonian in Italy and to take a boat across the ocean and research at the Smithsonian Institution in Naples. And that's Fairchild's first trip abroad. It's his first time on the ocean, on a steamer. And an encounter on that trip really defined sort of the destiny of his life. He met a benefactor, a man who offered him a little bit of money to pursue his travels and find new and novel plants.
That must have been fascinating. So, he meets this benefactor, and they start traveling around after a little bit of deliberation, right? Fairchild wasn't exactly sure that this is where he wanted to go. Obviously we can't recapitulate the whole book here, but what are some of your favorite adventures that he goes on? Do you think that were important to our food system here in the United States?
Yeah, Fairchild and his benefactor Barbara Lathrop go on a tour around the Cape of South America. And they stop in Chile, and Fairchild picks up varieties of avocados. Avocados are native to Mexico, but he found them a little bit further south. Fairchild later is in Italy, and he finds varieties of seedless grapes that he introduces. On another trip, he's in South Asia, and all the way from India to the Philippines, he picks up mangoes, more than 50 varieties of mangoes, and introduces them to subtropical land in the U.S., mainly in Florida, Southern California. Fairchild is responsible for kale, for Egyptian cotton. He picked up varieties of watermelons in Brazil and of nectarines in Pakistan. He's also responsible for the cherry blossom trees that were gifted from the Japanese to Washington, D.C. in 1912. He arranged that exchange.
So you've written that the U.S. government got involved and was supporting and kind of asking him to do more of this at some point. So was this something that they had been interested in before, or sort of did Fairchild's adventures kind of spark the government interest in this?
The government had always been interested in plants from abroad because plants were economic assets. Before, the days of globalization and goods being manufactured, the way a country grew was really through plants. Thomas Jefferson, even, in the late 18th century, said the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to introduce a plant to its culture, right? Find a new plant. And so the work of plant introduction was really the work of the State Department. That was foreign policy. The USDA didn't exist until the 1860s with Abraham Lincoln. Before that, the USDA was just run as an office of the State Department. And consuls and consular officers were just asked as part of their other duties to just send in plants when something interesting came along. So Fairchild came with this age-old notion that foreign plants were valuable, but with a new vision of how he could streamline the process and how he could introduce these plants better and faster and more scientifically, scrutinous with the greater chance of success.
So in addition to the actual plants that he brought back, what would you say the major contribution in this way was in terms of that process, right? In terms of how he brought them back or how he kept them or the methodology he chose for what to try to bring back?
He really defined his success with economic growth. So if you think of the citrus growers of California, orange groves, lemon groves, grapefruits grown in California, that didn't really exist as a giant commercial industry the way we saw in the mid and late 20th century. Avocados certainly are now a huge commercial industry, and the economics have shifted in labor. So now we grow and import most of our avocados from abroad in Mexico. The same is really true for cotton. Fairchild introduced a form of long grain cotton from Egypt that then became known as Egyptian cotton, right? Fine luxury cotton. He introduced varieties of mangoes that really transformed South Florida. And he introduced the cherry blossoms from Japan that weren't really a commercial crop. There's not really any fruit to sell. But they were so beautiful that now cherry blossoms grow in almost every major American city.
Right, and pretty defining in Washington.
And are giant sources of tourist and economic activity.
Yeah, I think the case of cotton is particularly interesting, right? Because the Egyptians were closely guarding their cotton, or they didn't want it to spread widely because of its high quality, right?
Yeah.
And it was really what helped to drive some parts of the U.S.'s economy when they were able to get this new variety, right?
What's interesting about cotton is that cotton is not from Egypt, never has been, and Egyptians didn't really have much experience with cotton. But around the 1850s and 60s, when the Civil War started in the U.S., and all those cotton plantations suddenly didn't have the labor that they had before, the whole cotton industry in America collapsed. And Egypt, sensing the worldwide demand for it, started growing cotton and spent about 3 decades growing cotton and growing better cotton until the 1890s and early 20th century. Suddenly, Egypt was the cotton powerhouse and started selling cotton back to the U.S. And so it was Fairchild's introduction that really helped bridge from that high-quality cotton in Egypt to make it an American crop again.
Sure. I mean, it's fascinating thinking about how those inner politics play and how important a simple introduction can be like that. What were some of the big challenges that Fairchild had in getting some of these things back into the United States?
He had botanical problems and shipping problems. He also had problems of diplomacy, going to a foreign country and asking them for their most prized seeds or cuttings was often, not easy. People were skeptical. Sometimes he was arrested. Sure. He would sometimes catch diseases. This was very dangerous work. But even if he got the seeds or the cuttings or the fruit, how do you package a plant to survive on a ship for 2 months?
And you don't know how long it's going to be either, right?
It could be longer. Yeah. And it could go through the tropics. It could, be very hot. Mold could grow very easily. And so he always experimented with shipping methods. And sometimes he would take a cutting like of a citrus plant and he would stick it in a potato, which was sort of moist inside, and it would nourish it for a few months. Mm-hmm. Sometimes he would take like a date tree where he goes in Baghdad and he rolls these date suckers in mud, in several layers of mud, so that the inside will stay wet and the outside will harden and keep any moisture out. He also experimented with peat moss and any type of packing or growing moss or material that local farmers would suggest.
Yeah, so he had those issues in getting things across the oceans and whatnot. He had some issues back home though too when he was trying to bring some of these plant materials in, and he ran into some colleagues that thought that this wasn't such a good idea, right? So what happened there? Yeah.
This is a story of a man who brings in plants from all over the world, and it sounds very rosy, but it also could be very dangerous, sure. Right? And actually, there was a friend of his, a young man who grew up also here in Manhattan, who was a K-State alumnus, named Charles Marlatt, who graduated here in entomology, and he became an entomologist for the USDA, an insect scientist. And his concern was, well, these plants are great, but what about the risks? What about, what's going to happen when we introduce a new insect or a new type of fungus that destroys an entire field or a whole industry? And so Fairchild was constantly trying to combat the idea that we shouldn't be introducing plants at all because the risks were too great and it wasn't worth the potential damage.
Yeah, so he has roots in the reason why we have to fill out the little slip on the airplane when we're coming back from international flights, right? Yeah. So, what's it been like since you've written the book? Talking to people about this, are people like blown away that this kind of thing had happened, and that's how our history in food, or what's the response been?
It surprises a lot of people the same way it surprised me when I first learned about this, and people generally don't think about food as traveling, right? Food as an immigrant that travels across oceans or gets introduced to a country. So, you go into your market, your avocados, your mangoes, your bananas, all these things were brought here. And people usually say, wow, I never thought about that. Mm. Another reaction I get, which is always interesting, is why haven't we heard of him? If he was so influential and he did all these amazing things that still affect our daily lives, why don't we know his name? And there are many reasons, but one reason is that he was a botanist, right? He was a plant scientist, and we don't usually celebrate scientists of plants the way we do scientists of technology or industry. He was also a government employee, so he never made a lot of money. He was never rich. He never patented his work. So when you compare him to the big names of his era, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone, these people who made a lot of money, and were sort of the titans of their day, Fairchild was pretty modest, and he was always traveling. He never really had newspaper profiles written about him because he was abroad. So, he wrote a lot of things down, but he wasn't really elevated to celebrity status the way many of his peers were.
Sounds just like the farming not getting the popularity, right, or the attention, right,
Yeah.
just from before. It's like the same thing, even though he starts a whole bunch of industry off right here, right?
How many farmers, famous farmers.
Yeah, famous farmers.
Famous, make that a website, famousfarmers.com. Yeah. Or, agronomists or botanists are, become sort of high level influential figures. It's pretty small.
Yeah. What are the major lessons you think the story has for today?
That our food is an adventure. What we eat and why we eat it has roots back, usually about 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. That, someone carrying it on a ship or someone introducing it in a field and growing it into an industry that's very perilous, right? It could go wrong at any point, and usually it did. And so our food is very geographic in a way we don't often think. There are also, ecological components of this kind of work that are still present today, and even more so. Bringing in a new plant could introduce a new insect. Right. And that was true then. People were worried.
Did he just get lucky, do you think?
He got pretty lucky. A lot of these things were inspected. Okay. Maybe not as thoroughly, but, there were probably also some small disasters of, individual fields or crops, or perhaps insects that destroyed something that we will
don't
never know
what happened.
If they were linked to his introductions.
Right.
Certainly with the cherry blossom trees, they were introduced with 6 types of scale insect, and they had to be burned on the National Mall. And a second shipment of trees had to be sent.
Right.
And so that was a disaster averted. But today, that's even more true because, not only are people coming into every country, but certainly our country from every port in every city, but dirt on your shoe that you brought in from China this morning, could be introduced into a field in Kansas this afternoon. Yep. Same with, someone coming from the U.S. to Africa, right? Introducing new types of fungus, new insects that really are the result of a more interconnected and globalized world that could be really ecologically dangerous.
Do you have any opinions on the best policy ways to address these kinds of issues?
The quarantines are really helpful.
Yep.
Certainly filling out the form on airplanes, declaring any agricultural material, if you do declare it, right? It's sort of optional, is generally good policy, right? It's better than nothing. It's not really enough, and I don't think any government really has it figured out what would be enough.
Right.
I mean, some of these things are microscopic, what you could introduce. Right. We haven't had a global, food disaster yet, and certainly not in a long time.
Right.
But these insects can have, really devastating effects over time, over decades.
I mean, in some sense, this is just one of the risks that we have to deal with, right? With the global system, right? The way we're all connected. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Scott and I have talked about that before, just how fragile our food system really is, even though we have this globalized network, right? If something gets brought in that, shouldn't be there, could have devastating effects, right?
Yeah, the upside is that now we have far more advanced science, and that we have researchers in microbiology labs who can sort of solve problems. But, the upside to 100 years ago was that they just didn't have this constant flow of potential contamination. So, the modern world comes with positives and negatives of, problems we can solve and problems we can also, launch, create.
So one of the
go ahead.
All right. So one of the things you were saying about Fairchild, at Fairchild's time, the farming at the time was pretty. There are a few crops, right, that everybody was trying to farm, right? Do you have other lessons there today for us in terms of diversity of food? I mean, some of the things people are concerned about with monocultures are different. They're not just the economic ones that we're all eating the same thing, right? So there's more questions about sustainability and the ability to resist, issues like we're just talking about here, right? Are there lessons that we can draw about diversifying our food system from Fairchild, or is it a different world now?
Our food system is pretty diverse now, far more diverse than it was 150
Partly
years
because
ago.
of Fairchild and continuing actions like this, right?
Yeah. Our farms are not as diverse, certainly not geographically. Most of our fruits and vegetables are grown in California and out west. Most of our cereals are grown in the Midwest and the South. And there are exceptions, but that's in both cases, it's an effect of economics. In Fairchild's day, more crops led to more money and more economic growth. In our economy today, fewer crops, but growing them on more acreage is what yields the greatest profit. Farming is really hard work, but it's also really risky. And if you're a farmer today and someone comes to you with a new crop and asks you to plant it in your field and you've never grown it before, that's a risk.
Yeah, sure.
And maybe it won't work out. And maybe you'd just rather stick with the corn or soybeans that you've got growing in your farm in Iowa.
Do you have thoughts about general policies on this, about how we can shift the economics of this, like with the food bill? And what do you want to say about that?
Generally, farming works best when it's not just big landowners doing it, right? When you have individual landholders who can make individual decisions about their land. That was true 50 years ago. We had more farmers then than we do now. The trends are going, farmers are getting older and farms are getting bigger as they're getting bought up by bigger and bigger companies. Generally, ag subsidies can be both harmful and helpful to drive some of these policy changes, to encourage farmers to grow new things, to create more ecological diversity, to reduce the risk of a disease coming through and demolishing an entire crop over a whole state or region. But with the Farm Bill, part of it's about food and part of it's about farming. And more people farming in different ways, even if it's like kind of crazy ways, like in a skyscraper in Manhattan, right? That's not going to solve our food problem, but it is diversity in a way.
So maybe this is a good time to transition. We'd like to talk a little bit more about your experience as a journalist, and your title now is a contributing editor to National Geographic, right? And you mentioned before that botanists and sometimes scientists and farmers don't get a lot of recognition. So what do you see as the role of journalism in the media in the the environment, the ag, food community, and that sort of thing? What do you think about that?
Yeah, farming is usually a really hard story to tell because it's really complicated. It's not always, the sexiest story out there. It's really important, but, it's not as vivid or salacious as, stories of tension, with politics or with sports or religion, right? Usually I find the best stories about farming and food to come from people. If you can find people willing to tell those stories, someone in Kansas who has experienced a farming problem and can give voice, right? Someone in Manhattan who's starting a vertical farm, right, to grow lettuce. That person has a passion and a reason for doing it, and they usually are the best spokesperson for why they're doing it. Farms are dying, as we've heard, right? So farmers are getting older, and they're selling their farms to big companies. So what is it about farming that doesn't really attract younger people, right? What is it about farming that attracts mostly men, right? These are stories about people that explain this industry in a more narrow way.
What are you trying to accomplish when you pick a story? Are you just trying to anything that would interest the reader, or is there something you're trying to get at?
That's deep. Yeah.
He's the philosopher.
Yeah,
that's right.
I'm a storyteller at heart. Most journalists are. I want to tell a good story that someone's going to be interested in. That's one. But journalism is also powerful. You can teach people things. You can drive change in a way that's maybe not political change, but maybe it's like a form of ecological change or a way we think about the planet. You could raise awareness for an issue that's not getting it. I used to cover politics and covered the White House, and I liked it, but I didn't really like it that much because 50 other reporters are sitting in that same room trying to get their questions answered, and you're not really telling a story that's unique. But with science writing, you have the potential to go out there and find something that's happening and maybe raise a red flag about it, maybe vocalize it in a new way, maybe tell the story of someone who doesn't usually get their voice heard, and with farmers, they don't often get heard, So I think telling the stories of the voiceless is fascinating and usually leads really great stories.
So do you spend a lot of time in the field, like looking for these types of stories or finding, to find people? I know in the past you've done, trips like up through California where you've reported every day on, on sort of interesting things that you found and that sort of thing. So how do you go about, finding an assignment and then, what do you do to delve into it?
I usually start with trends, right? And I read a lot of reports and studies, kind of really dense academic publications about farming and food.
That's where you start.
Yeah, because it's, those aren't the best stories, but sort of you could see what's happening on the ground.
Sure.
As opposed to just, if I were to leave from D.C. and kind of drive here to Manhattan, Kansas, I'd probably meet a lot of quirky characters along the way, and maybe I could tell a story of one of them.
Sure.
But if I want to tell the story about America or how it's changing or the economy of Kansas or, how climate change is affecting farms across the country, I'm probably going to see that in some changing statistic, or I'm going to see it in a new trend that's emerging in farming equipment, or a new crop that suddenly is being imported, at twice the rate that it was before because there's a new market for it. And once you find that trend, then you could go find people who sort of embody it. And when you start talking to people, usually they recommend other people and then other people and other people. So, you could find those compelling and quirky characters in a much more targeted and efficient way.
Do you find that people generally want to talk about their story?
Some do, some don't. Some people have never been asked by a reporter to give comment. Some are very wary of the media,
sure,
right? They don't want their words to be misconstrued. Some people are very enthusiastic. I've had the doors slammed in my face. I've been invited in for coffee and tea and everything in between. So, the part of reporting is not that you always get, nice treatment. But if you try, and spend enough time doing it, you sort of meet the people who have the stories to tell.
Do you think that when you're reading those scientific papers and things, the scientists could use a little help, a little journalistic help in telling their stories? Do you think it would be more effective that way?
Yes. Yeah. Scientists are usually very good at what they do. Communication is not always a strong suit, and the best scientists, the most effective ones, are the ones who really can convey their research and convey the importance of what they're trying to accomplish and trying to find. And the scientists that, can go on TV or do podcasts or write articles for newspapers are really the ones with the best chance of not only raising research funding, but also being heard and being seen.
So one of the challenges I've heard people talk about with this is that a lot of the science that gets done, it's hard to find the story there, right? I mean, so you're finding some facts out, you're discovering some phenomenon, you're whatever, right? But then you can always turn this into the story of what you in your lab discovering. I mean, like what's the where? I mean, because that's, as a journalist, you keep on talking about the stories, right? Sort of like, let's find the person, let's find who's affected by this, right? Do you have any tips in terms of how to, turn that general? You said you look for some trend, or there's a sense a story out there about America or about some new technological change, but then you have to change that and you have to make that personal, right?
Yeah,
so how do you think about that project?
Well, not all science is worthy of deep stories, right? Some are very incremental, especially like gene research that sort of yields some super complicated genetic difference between different races. Like that. Those are hard stories to conceptualize. So you don't have to take every finding and every study the same way seriously. But, we do all sorts of stories at National Geographic. And one that comes to mind, to your question, we did a story maybe like 3 years ago on dung beetles and how dung beetles effectively kind of wear these, researchers put silicone boots over their legs that allow them to walk over hotter sand, right? And it's like, who cares, right? Like the dung beetles. But it's also sort of fascinating. So here's the way you would tell that story. Maybe not, you wouldn't talk to dung beetles. You may not even talk to the researcher, maybe. But photos or videos of dung beetles wearing boots, right? I mean, I click on that, right?
That's right next to the cat pictures.
Visuals really help. Can you bring this to life? Can you show a beautiful photo of, a dung beetle at sunset? When it's a story about, prairie grass in western Kansas, that's not like the sexiest story. But if you can pair it with beautiful photography, with stunning portraits of people affected, usually that'll draw in the eye. And once you have people's attention, maybe they'll read the story.
And this is one of the things National Geographic has been so good at for so long, right? Sort of that
photos.
Photographic
We
angle,
invest
right?
a lot in the photography, and a lot can sometimes be months or years, thousands, hundreds of thousands of photos to try to get a dozen or a couple dozen that are really
so
sharp.
Much work, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, with the photos though, there's sort of an emotional component too, right? I mean, that's what's drawing people in. So how do you think about using emotion in your articles and things like that to kind of draw people in, but you want to still tell an objective story, right? Is it okay to sort of lean one way or the other, or how do you go about thinking about the ethics of that?
We want to get their attention. We want to be honest in how we do it.
Sure.
We don't want to put a photo of a salacious photo of like a half-naked person, right? And just be like, gotcha, now you got to read, right? But, we want to draw them in with, like you said, emotion, with a sense of here's why you should care. So maybe with a dung beetle, it's the photo or the video that shows something you've never seen that sort of makes you full of wonder, right? With an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon, maybe it's portraits that make you see in someone's eyes something similar that you feel, right? And sort of makes you feel that the world isn't as big as you thought, and that these cultures are not as foreign or distant or exoticized, right, as you would think. So it's using visual storytelling to connect with people in a way that they are interested and is honest, and not every single person's going to be interested in every story. That's not our job. But in the magazine, to find a story or two that someone can read and look at and just stare at the page and go, wow, about the earth or a culture or a place. That's the goal. And when we get it, it's really gratifying.
What do you think about the state of culture today in terms of openness to science reporting, in particular ag reporting? There's been a period of time when people thought science journalism was, on its way out, right? Sort of newspapers had their science gig or whatever you call it, right? And sort of, those things got lost, right? And those are going by the wayside. So people were worried about science journalism for a while, but we've got a lot of new ways to reach people today, and things maybe look different with the podcast landscape, with ways National Geographic is reaching out. It's not just the print magazine, right? It's web presence. How do you feel about the state of science journalism and just the popular interest in science reporting and science stories?
I think it's a good time for journalism, and it's generally a good time for journalists. That's not true for every small town newspaper. Not every website can survive.
Right.
But there are more people reading more news now than ever before in history. Science, sports, business, whatever it is, people have this hunger. And social media has made it easy to feed that hunger constantly. So we have more news out there. We have more reporters digging for more things. The business of news isn't the same.
Right.
It's much harder to make a profit in news, and that drives our decisions. What stories are worth investing in and which aren't. But one other side effect that really challenges journalists and science journalists is the believability, how we're perceived by readers, in this era of fake news, of people mistrusting either the mainstream media or just the media in general, is that facts are subjective, that a story that is reported rather objectively could be seen as propaganda, right? That's new. And that poses challenge because even, 20 years ago, a story that was printed that had a series of facts and quotes in it was generally taken as the way the world was. Now we have almost anyone can produce news and report news on social media at any time. And that leads to kind of a crisis of credibility for a lot of what we're reading and getting.
Right. This has been one of these things that I've been, a lot of people are thinking about. Sort of scientists are sometimes worried about getting out there in the public and sort of advocating, right, and being engaged in policy debates and engaging, as Jay was saying, on the emotional side of things, right? So you might understand that you need that to reach people, but it's taking another step, at least outside the comfort zone and maybe outside the zone of what you feel your responsibility as a scientist is, right? So sort of stay objective and neutral, right? And it's an interesting thing that we're now at a state where, like, even if you're staying objective and neutral, you're in the same... I mean, in some sense, you're being perceived the same whether you went out there and you politicized or you just stayed totally neutral. And I don't know what that means for the state of scientists communicating and advocating and getting engaged in policy. But it's for sure a different world.
Yeah, I don't think the role of a journalist is either to be neutral or objective. Neutral means sort of standing in the middle,
right,
even though the middle might not be where the debate is raging. Right?
Right.
And objective means sort of considering both sides with equal weight when both sides might not, have equal levels of research behind them.
The both sides tell both sides story is it's a real problem.
I think the role of a journalist is to be skeptical, to take every set of facts and be scrutinous in whether you believe them, where they come from, who's coming up with them. And usually the people who have kind of the most evidence for what they're claiming are the ones who are right, and the people who don't have much to back up what they're saying don't have much to back up what they're saying. That speaks up for itself. Yeah.
It says something, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned the trust thing, and there's the emotional component. Some people like reading what makes them feel good or what they agree with, right? So, do you see, what's our sort of path out of this if everybody can be saying what they want all the time, right? Do you see journalism going in a sort of different direction, or how do journalists make sure that people perceive them the way they want to be perceived?
I don't know. It's a good question.
It's a tough question.
It's a really good question, and it's sort of our whole democracy kind of rests on the answer to it. Like, what will happen if people become more fractured in what they believe and where they're getting their information? I do think eventually this kind of national fever we have right now of partisan divisiveness will end eventually. I think it usually has in history, and we'll get to a point where we sort of settle on a new order and status quo. But, social media has done something that has never been done before in world history. It's democratized media, and it's enabled anyone, anywhere to spread something and gain traction, not based on fact, but based on popularity, right? So I don't know how media is going to change with that, but my role as a journalist and the reporters that I edit is not to try to change the news business and change all of journalism. It's to just keep doing the best job we can, and hopefully that's good enough. And if it's not, we'll know, but there's really nothing else we can do.
Do you have any advice for young people that want to get into journalism?
Run. Yeah. No. And I don't mean that. Journalism is a great field, and it's so rewarding. And, my journalism professor in college told me, he said, go into this field if you want to have a front row seat to history, right?
It's an interesting way.
Yeah. I mean, and why wouldn't that capture your imagination? And he was right. I mean, seeing political events, seeing, big cultural shifts and events, and being able to talk to fascinating people, I mean, that is the major upside. The downsides are that it's really competitive. You won't become rich, and it'll be hard to grow a career, especially as more and more people want to be journalists. Younger and younger people generally have, the skills for multimedia that older people don't, right?
Sure.
But hey, there are more people reading news, and there's more of an appetite for news than ever before. So, if you want to go for it, absolutely go for it. And I think you'll have a lot of fun doing it.
That's great. We want to be respectful of your time, but we really appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk to us, Dan. Thanks so much.
This has been great. Thanks to you both.
Great conversation. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, drop us an email or check out our website at kstate.edu/research/global food. I'm Jay Weeks. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.